So in this session we will be speaking about trend lines. So how you're supposed to use trend lines to identify strong levels of support or resistance, or in other words, strong levels of dynamic support and resistance, because that is what a trend line is. A trend line is a level of dynamic support and resistance. So basically, if I have a trending market, so the market is creating higher highs and higher lows, after I have two lows, and as you can see I have them here, I have this low here, I have this low here, at this point I can take my trend line. And what I mean by dynamic is that when the market will hit again this area, the area at which this trend line will give the support will depend on where is the market at the moment, where it is retracing, because if it traces like this very sharply, then the market will find support here. But if it retraces a little more softly, then it will find support here. So that is why I mean it's dynamic, because this level of support is always changing with price. Every time a new candle starts on the chart, this level of support, as you can see, is changing, is becoming always higher. And that is the reason for which I call it dynamic support and resistance, like for example a moving average. Now let's speak about how is the correct way to draw trend lines. Let's go over some charts. Now I drawed a couple trend lines here to show you the concept, and we will now go on all the pairs, basically just showing you the concept. Now the point is that most traders, when they see a low and they see a higher low, when they want to identify their level of dynamic support, what they will do is they will take the trend line from this low to this low, basically in this way. And this doesn't help at all, because if you take your trend line in this way, you will not be accurate. The rule with which you're supposed to draw your trend lines is this: you're supposed to take your trend line on the low, and on the next low you're supposed to touch as many candles as possible. Now what I mean by as many candles as possible, in this particular case you touched only one candle, this candle here, but if you want to be much more accurate, you're going to touch both candles. In this way, by touching this low here and both these candles, you will be much more accurate around this area in identifying this level of support. And the same things goes, for example, for this trend line here. The market has a high here and has another high here, and if you want to identify the levels of support, so dynamic support of this trend line, what you're supposed to do is take your trend line this way. Now I already know that many traders will take their trend line in this way, so from the high, from this high here to this high here. But if you do this, you don't get confluence, because you won't be accurate in the market. If you try to touch as many candles as possible, then you will be better in identifying where the market will find resistance. Now I took also another couple of examples here about this concept, and I will now keep going to really show you exactly how you're supposed to do it. If you have this kind of move, so you have a high, you have another high, and let's say you have also another high, and you want to identify your levels of resistance, what you will do, I know that many traders will take their trend line this way, touching the wicks. Now if you touch the wicks, it's true, you are almost accurate in this case. But if you touch as many candles as possible, then you also identify this level of resistance. And when the market broke and went through a retest, you identify the break and retest in a very accurate way, because as you know, when a trend line is broken and the market goes for a retest, if the trend line was resistance, now it becomes support, exactly as the same concept as I have explained for you with the previous support and resistance. It applies to everything in the market. If a level breaks and it was resistance, it then becomes support. Very simple concept. So in this case, if you took it, if you put the trend line as I just showed you, you will be much more accurate in the market, much more accurate. So keep going. If you have a high here, you have a high here, and you have another high here, most traders will take the trend line this way. But if you do this, you are not identifying many levels. If you do it this way, so basically what changed is that you're not touching only this candle here, but you're also touching this area. So you basically are touching as many candles as possible without cutting the bodies, because that is the rule. You have to put the trend line on the high, touch as many candles as possible, but you can't cut the bodies. What I mean by you can't cut the bodies, you can't cut the colors of the candles. You can't take it in this way, because in this way you're cutting this red candle here. So what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to take it in this way, because in this way you're touching both candles but you're not cutting the bodies. Very simple concept. And if you do this, basically what you do is you identify this level of resistance that it would have been possible to identify if you had drawn it in the other way. Now let's just keep going with more examples. Now here, as I showed you, as I just drew, you have a very strong weekly trend line from this high to this high. Now if you take it from the high to the high, like most traders do, so in this way, you will never be able to identify this level of resistance. If, however, you take your trend line a little bit lower, so almost at the bodies, then you will be able, and you will be very accurate in identifying this level of resistance. Now let's just keep going. If you take your trend line from this low to this low here, you will not be very accurate in the market, because you won't really have the maximum confluence you can get on this particular trend line. If, however, you put the trend line this way, then you are basically almost able to identify this level of support almost 100% precise, and you also realize that this candle broke the trend line. And when this candle broke the trend line, at that point the push to the downside started. So you will always be more accurate if you take trend lines basically in this way. So if you take trend lines, touching as many candles as possible without cutting the bodies. Let's look at another example. If you take your trend line this way, so basically from this low to this low, you don't have the maximum confluence you can get, and you will not be able to identify many levels. But if you take it in this way, so basically why I am more accurate, because if I take it in this way, I am basically only touching this candle and this candle. If, however, I move my trend line in this way, then at this point I'm touching 3 candles here, and I'm able to identify this level of support very precisely. I'm able to identify this level of support very precisely, and I'm able to identify this level of support very precisely. And if I had done it the way I've showed you before, like most traders do, this would have been almost impossible to do. So this is how you're supposed to use the trend lines. I don't want to keep this video too long, because obviously it's a very simple concept, but it's very important to know how you're supposed to draw your trend lines, and this goes for all time frames. So from the monthly to the 4-hour time frame, you always have to try to draw your trend lines touching as many candles as possible without cutting the bodies.